There we go. The recording is on. So just to introduce this topic today, today's topic is Matriculating While Queer, hosted by Dr. Ashley Bingham, or Dr. Bing. And this training today is meant to provide an overview of the hurdles that previously and currently stand in the way of queer student success. And it covers topics such as restroom accessibility, to creating an inclusive and supportive classroom environment. And attendees are meant to gain a better understanding of the lived experiences of LGBTQ+ university students and the ways in which administrators, faculty, and staff can advocate on their behalf. So at this time, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Bing and hand the reins over to her. So Dr. Bing joined the Virginia Tech and Cultural and Community Center staff during the fall of 2019 and serves as the director for the LGBTQ+ Resource Center and advisor to Hokie Pride. She works to support the mental, emotional, social, and physical well-being of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer Hokies by creating space and providing resources for marginalized individuals within the queer community and by facilitating learning opportunities for students, faculty, and staff. Dr. Bing received her bachelor's degree in psychology, her master's degree in social psychology, and her doctorate degree in higher education from Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana. And previously, Dr. Bing worked with Ball State University's Women's and Gender Study program to teaching classes and overseeing their marketing, promotion, and recruitment efforts. Alongside her work in academia, Dr. Bing created and ran the gender nonconforming fashion and lifestyle blog called I Dream of Dapper that has been featured by Autostraddle, BuzzFeed, Dapper Q, Hudson Jeans, Love Inc. magazine, Queer Fashion, and Madrid-based magazine S Moda. And Dr. Bing lives in Roanoke, Virginia with her partner and their two Maine Coon cats. So I will go ahead and hand over the reins to Dr. Bing.
It's moments like that when you realize that your entire life story is in a bio and you're like, yes, you should know about my cats. Of course you should. Their names are Zeta and Sully. They're very cute. I am going to go ahead and share my screen and make sure that the sound will also play for you all. Beautiful. All right, so let's get started. Of course, today we're going to be talking about matriculating while queer. That is me. My name is Ashley Bingham. I go by Dr. Bing, or Bing for short. And I work for the Resource Center in today's date. So let's go ahead and dive in a little bit for the name of this session. It is very purposely chosen, and it's one of those words that a lot of people find a little discomfort with usually. And I say that because I would say even in the promotion of this, we had some people reach out and saying, you know, I have some questions about your word choice. Queer is a word that today is being used far more positively and in sort of an empowerment kind of way. So here it explains that queer is now a reclaimed word, and it's generally accepted as an umbrella term. Throughout the presentation, you're going to see a couple of words that are in orange or they're underlined. We'll take a moment to kind of understand what those mean, their context in today's society. So this word obviously has had, is used as a slang, as a slur that is meant to devalue or invalidate queer identities or LGBTQ persons along the gender and sexual spectrum. Over time, we've kind of seen a reclaiming of that. So there are people who use it as a I'm queer and you can't do anything kind of a way about it. Queer and I'm here, get used to it. So we've seen a lot of that kind of reclaiming of this. When we talk about umbrella terms, however, we're talking about a larger term that many other identities will fit underneath. So one of the complaints that we get a lot in my line of work is the acronym is too long. The acronym constantly changes. There's constant additions to it. It's called the alphabet soup a lot of times. And I've also had it referred to as the GBLT, which sounds delicious, but isn't an actual thing. So we use it as an umbrella term for all those that fit under the gender, sexual, and romantic minorities. And we're gonna get into that part in just a minute. But it's a word that we use, not necessarily to say that all queer people are the same, but that because of the way that our society is structured, they're genuinely treated similarly. And that's kind of how an umbrella term and an umbrella word functions in this way. There are a number of people who have experienced it as a slur and will reject its use and do not prefer to be referred to as a queer person or as part of the queer community. That is a personal choice. If someone chooses to identify as queer, probably not the best idea to say, oh, excuse you, actually that's a slur. That is someone who has reclaimed, someone who has taken something back. So we're gonna let them do as they want to with those terms as the way that they're identifying. One of my favorite authors is Julia Serrano. She's written Excluded, Whipping Girl, and some lovely, amazing academic, kind of thick books to read through. But talks about how since mainstream values dominate in our culture, straight people can take their sexes, gender, sexualities for granted and are seen as what we call normal in this regard. When a person defies one or some of these assumptions, straight mainstream society often deems that person to be not straight and therefore queer. So we're going to get into exactly what queerness looks like right now. And I'm wondering if you all can see this all right, because I know I can see your faces, and I don't know if you can also see your faces in my screen. Are we good, Maya?
Yes, it looks great.
Perfect. Awesome. So right here is something we have the genderbread person. There's also one that's like the genderbread unicorn. I will say that I prefer to use something that's a little bit more human-esque, even if it is a cookie, just because unicorns aren't real and people are. That's a personal thing, but you will see multiple variations of this. I think there's even a robot one. We just really get very creative with some infographics for you. But here with the genderbread person, and you'll even notice it's the 3.2 version of this, and there might be a 3.5 by the time that we're done with this presentation, just on the way that we are learning and understanding new things about the human identity and the various elements that form that. So in the 3.2 version, you see that gender identity is sectioned out, gender expression, biological sex, sexually attracted to, and romantic to. Or romantically attracted to. And these are elements that we kind of understand as forming what a whole entire person looks like. And maybe an analogy to better understand this is when you think about how many colors there are in the world, there's just kind of an infinite amount. A lot of times it feels like, right? So you might be painting your house and you're trying to pick out just like that perfect shade of blue or that perfect shade of purple that's somewhere between like Rapunzel and like Barney, and you're just like, I've got to find that perfect shade. And of course it's going to look different in the light too, so then you have to take that into consideration. One way to kind of think about these various elements and how they work in people's lives is each of them is kind of like a different drop of a different color. So if gender identity is, let's say, blue, and gender expression is yellow, and biological sex is purple, and our romantic to is red, and our sexually attracted to is pink, depending of kind of where we fit on these sliding scales. Depends on how much blue goes into the bucket, how much pink goes into the bucket, how much yellow goes into the bucket, purple goes into the bucket. And what you get is a different color each and every time. In this, you're going to have colors that kind of live within the same family. So you're going to have your little blue family, you're going to have your little yellow family, you're going to have your mustards, you're going to have your yellow, like your bright sun yellows. In your blue family, you're going to have like your really nice royal blues and your baby blues that are coming back from the 90s. But you've got these variations, and that's kind of how these elements work when we're talking about identity, is there's kind of an infinite combinations of what someone will identify with as terms of gender, gender expression, their biological sex, who they're sexually attracted to, and who they're romantically attracted to. So just an infinite number. And this really kind of screws up the idea that there is an LGBTQ, because those are very concrete kind of blocks that we put people in. But our understanding of gender and sexuality is far more fluid and far more on a spectrum than we really understand. So as we're going through this, I want you to challenge your ideas that there are these very set identities and we stay within them, and there are only these, because for each and every combination, every drop of blue or yellow or purple or red, we have different labels for. And those labels are going to change over time in the same way that we can kind of talk about someone who doesn't fit the absolutes of these. So we'll call that like the white paint, not that, but we'll call that the straight, white, cis person. Anything that's outside of that absolute, let's say, pure white, that like standard color that everyone's just like, I just want the normal white, and we'll just go with that normality. Anything outside of that is queerness. And we're seeing that the vocabulary around that has adapted quite differently. Where there wasn't a word for lesbians, now there's a word for lesbians. Where there wasn't a word for gay men, there's a word for gay men. Where there wasn't a word for trans women, there's a word for that. When there wasn't a word for what it looks like if someone doesn't quite identify as cis, but they don't necessarily identify as trans, maybe they fit in a gender nonconforming area. So we're seeing our language and our understanding of these things and how they influence things very differently. And this kind of gives you a very messy, very way, but if you wanted to, you could take a moment and you could say, well, I probably identify here on the sliding scale, so I probably have that much blue, and I'm pretty feminine, so I'm probably gonna be here, or I'm pretty masculine. And you can kind of figure out your color, but it's a fun thing to think about, and this is one of the ways that we can conceptualize what makes up the human identity. Now, it's important to understand that these identities are impacted by outside thought. And because this specifically, and I love that this is like moved text around, I promise you that it was not originally, it's not like I was like, I don't care about boxes. Because this conversation we're having is in an educational context, we need to first, we need to also understand that this is a context of an institution of oppression, or is a part of institutional oppression. And what we're talking about is depending on what color you end up being, or depending on your combination of identities. And this kind of comes back to what we talked about when I was talking about umbrella, of being treated a certain way. These institutions reinforce ideologies or systems of belief and thought, and that informs how we create law, how we educate, how we govern our land, our people, our children, all these different things. And so a couple of little examples of what I mean when we're talking about institutions of oppression or institutional oppression is religion, the church, a very sacred place for many, a source of hope, a source of thinking that there's more in this world and that we should be good people. And there's a lot of beneficial lessons that come out of the church, but we also have churches who very much have taken the Bible and because we're in the United States, I'll use Christianity as kind of like our key text for this example. That's what many of our students, and I would say even the Catholic Church to an extent, will interpret these texts in this way. But when we look at even, let's say, Leviticus, where the words originally in Hebrew have been interpreted and taught to be anti-homosexual, anti-gay, anti-LGBTQ, referring to queerness as a detestable sin, and it as a capital offense and a act that should be end in death for the individuals. And that's how it's often taught. So that's where we see this institutional oppression of something that is interpreted. We reinforce that ideology, and that's what we teach. And so then these people think you cannot be a queer person and be a good person because it is a sin and you should die. When we get into government, we can look at how acts between queer people have been interpreted and how they have been reinforced through law. So prior to 1962, sodomy was a felony in every state and punishable by imprisonment or hard labor. After 1962, after the model penal code was developed, they removed consensual sodomy from the criminal code, woo-woo, but to solicit for sodomy was still a crime. And we were seeing that there's they find ways to make the law represent ideas. So we can say like, oh, well, you absolutely can't find somebody. So like Tinder would be just like the worst, or Grindr would be like, oh my gosh, they're soliciting for sodomy, we must punish them. Things that we are now kind of past, but ways that the government has shaped our ideas of how we should understand queerness and how we should interact with queerness. And then, because we are at Virginia Tech in a educational space, we look at how education has been formed. And a lot of our students have gone through a lot of school, and now they're coming to more school. And in these, we can understand a little bit about where they're coming from by understanding what their educational systems were teaching them, and what kind of ideologies or systems of thought were being reinforced during their years in junior high and high school. We see that homosexuality has been prohibited as even being talked about in schools for a number of times. They've called these the no promo homo laws, which you've got to give it to them. That's pretty dang funny. In which they forbid the promotion of homosexuality. Sometimes that just means that they're not allowed to talk about homosexuality or queer acts between two consenting people at all. Or there's these laws that kind of mirror what we saw out of some early ideas of like, how do we censor media, in which they can talk about homosexuality, but they can only talk about it negatively. So you can only talk about how horrible it is to be a queer person and to commit queer acts. So we see this reinforcement of queer is bad, queer is sinful, queer is punishable by death or by hard labor. These ideas, so very much we're following this trend of institution has an idea, they reinforce that idea through teachings, through laws, through interpretations, and that informs our understanding and our ideas of these things. So so there we go. Institutions and ideologies, they reinforce and inform students' understandings of themselves and those around them. It's important to remember that this isn't just a conversation about how queer kids get through higher education. It's a conversation about how our students are understanding queerness and how they're interacting with queerness on a daily basis. And a lot of times it's those other students who may be causing some difficulties in other students' lives, and that goes as well for faculty and staff. So, based on your own experiences, what are some of those ideologies that have been reinforced regarding queer identities? I want you to think about times in your own life and experiences that you've had. It can be in the church, it can be in law, it can be in education, it can be in media. It could be just things that you've heard from other people, because social influences are a huge thing to keep in mind. But what are some of those ideologies that you've been exposed to that were in regards to queer identities? And what do you think were some of those resulting understandings of them? And I'm going to ask you all to share with me. Like Maya said, I come from a women and gender studies background, and I love teaching in that. And I will tell you right now, and this will set kind of the stage for the rest of our time together, that I firmly believe that a session is only as good and as beneficial as there is interaction from people. So if you've come to this and you want to sit, you're like, you're going to teach me all the things, we're going to get nothing back from you, and we're not going to have as good of a time, and we're not going to be able to understand things. So I'm going to ask that if you find yourself bored, maybe it's because you're being boring, and we need you to engage back with us. So I want you, I know this means that some of you are going to be vulnerable, and I promise I will return that in like tenfold. But I'm going to ask you to kind of be honest with me, work with me, and really let's engage and let's see what we can get out of this together, because every single session is going to be different. A really great presenter can teach you absolutely nothing if there's no engagement. And a really awful presenter can host an amazing session because the people involved in it decided to make it better. So let's try one. I'm going to try not to be a horrible presenter. You try and not let me have a horrible time, and we're going to do this together. So with that said, based on your own experiences, what are some of those ideologies that you've seen reinforced regarding queer identities? And what are some of those resulting understandings that you or someone else has walked away from?
And folks, you're free to use the chat also if you prefer to engage in that way, and I'll be reading those out loud.
Thanks, Maya.
So I think for me, I come from a background that, you know, the family and friends I surround myself like claim to be very liberal and progressive in their beliefs and views, but still like the implicit bias and the prejudice that they hold, like they're unaware of it. And so they'll say things such as, you know, no homo, or I'm not gay. Why would they think that? Oh, but it's not bad to be gay. Then why are you upset? Just a lot of those underlying comments like, oh, I have no issue with gay people, but I would never want my children to be gay because it would make their life harder. And so again, like stopping the individual instead of stopping like society itself.
Yeah. Thank you, Brooke. Those are great examples. I appreciate that. And thank you for your vulnerability.
Yep.
Other folks?
There's one in the chat from Amanda Armstrong sharing that those with queer identities or expressions won't be happy in life. And it's reinforced by assumptions regarding marriage ideals and Christianity. And Julie shared, at a previous job, a coworker said, I don't mind if he's gay, I just don't want to hear about it or see it. I asked him if he would be happy if I asked him to stop talking about his wife.
Well done. Well done. It's funny when we draw those parallels. They're like suddenly like, oh, I'm pushing shame onto somebody, and for my own comfort. I do want to touch on what Amanda said there for a hot second. And this is, I promise to be as vulnerable with you as always. When I came out to my family, my mother, and I love her very dearly, she just said, I don't want you to be sad. I just don't want you to be sad and alone. I said, okay, well, I'm not sure why being gay would make me sad and alone. And she goes, well, that's all I've ever seen. I used to teach with these women, and we all just kind of assumed they were gay, but they were just so sad and they were so alone. And it wasn't until we started talking about why these people were sad and why were they alone and what kind of external pressures, what kind of external forces have made these people have made their lives incredibly challenging, have made relationships difficult. And she's like, oh, okay. And so my mom, somebody who can be a little bubbly and a little happy, was like, oh, the gay people are sad. And I'm like, Mom, gay literally can be interpreted to be happy. And so there's something that's really making a roadblock for you there. And it was these ideas that you can't be happy. You have to be sad. You've got to be a depressed, sad lady with like 12 cats. So thank you for that, Amanda.
Amanda said, thanks for sharing. There's another one. It says from Matthew Ebert, my mom was adamant when I was a young boy that if I ever got one ear pierced instead of both, that people would think I was gay. Same with wearing purple or pink. Even as a kid, that logic made zero sense to me. Learning more over the years, I think that distanced approach to trying to visualize what gay people look like is born from not really knowing people who are different from us, like white, cis, heterosexual, etc. Mm-hmm. And then James Newcomer shared, I've heard people in right-winged media talk about the higher suicide rate of transgender individuals as a reason to not accept transgender individuals as a part of society. Apparently, they aren't aware that the non-acceptance they promote might be driving that suicide rate.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I want to just touch a little bit on the purple and the earring, because I do think those are two amazing kind of like cultural things that were developed through the queer community that I personally just have so much respect and love for. Is that was a way for queer people to find other queer people without mainstream really getting a hold of that. And then as soon as kind of like people started to clue in and be like, there's a lot of queer people who have one ear pierced, it became like now like, oh, we've got to watch out for it. So it kind of backfired on them in a lot of ways. But I think it's one of those things that it's really cool to see the resilience of that community and to see them try and find community in various different ways. We call that flagging in a lot of contexts, where we talk about like small acts that are done to find community or to be able to express yourself. That's because it's unsafe. You saw after the 2016 election, there was that safety pin flagging that everyone kind of did, and it's a very queer kind of act to flag. But we were seeing a lot of people wear safety pins to say that they were a safe place, that they believed that whatever had happened, they did not agree with, and that it would be okay to talk to them about it. And so it was really kind of funny to see this like very queer thing become mainstream in this situation, and that was really interesting. Another piece of flagging, and this is just kind of queer interesting facts, is queer women would paint one nail differently than all the others. And so that's how you could be able to figure out if someone was into someone of the same sex, is that one of their fingernails would be painted differently. And that actually became a large beauty pattern. So you'll see a lot of women who will go to the salon. They're like, okay, I want all of these one color, but this one can be sparkly, or I want all of these sparkly, but this one's gonna be different. And they're actually emulating a very queer behavior that's happened and kind of taken that as their own, but it's really kind of funny to see. So thank you for bringing that up.
There are a couple more in the chat. Caleb Branson shared, from my Christian upbringing, the ideology that being queer is a sin, is wrong, and should be punishable. This was also backed up by my K through 12 education, where I attended a small private school that had unspoken rules that you could not bring someone of the same sex to school functions, which brought about shame to those who wished to do so. Boys also could not join the cheerleading squad for fear that they were gay. These rules created unsafe environments for many of my friends and classmates who felt like they could not be their true selves without punishment and shame from their community. And then Kelsey has shared, from a fellow psych major, I feel like there was, and sometimes still is, this inaccurate concern that anyone identifying as queer, and particularly trans, are just confused or need some help, not realizing that they will literally have to have better well-being when they feel accepted.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And Kelsey, because you brought up psychology, the DSRM, so the actual kind of like psychological Bible that referred to queerness as a mental illness has been one of those huge parts of education and medicine and in many of these institutions, and fed into that greatly. So thank you so much for bringing that up. Those are all phenomenal examples, and thank you very much for sharing. And I apologize, I don't remember your name when you wrote this, but you were talking, someone was talking about the influence of Christianity in the church and those reinforced ideologies. And I remember that it's not I remember I used to work at a summer camp. It was named Rainbow Christian Camp. The ha-has are very much not intentional. It was not a Christian camp for gay kids. It was a camp that was built out of the promise of love and support from a deity. But it was really fun. And we slept 2 by 2 in an ark with bunk beds, and it was kind of like always a joke. But I remember one time I was riding in a vehicle. We were going to go pick up some new campers, or we're going to pick up some new staff members. And I remember the conversation in the front of the van was about athletics. And being not that kind of lesbian, I was like, I'm going to just tune out. I'm going to do my own thing. And my ears perked up because they were talking about how one of their favorite basketball players had spoken up about how poorly queer people were being treated, and how he was very staunchly against the bullying of queer people. And I was like, oh, that's great, cool, good for athletics, way to get some like really good role models in there, that's phenomenal. And the conversation that followed was, well, I'm not going to support him anymore. So not even was it being queer is sinful, but then to then support and to be against the harming emotional, both emotional and physical, of queer people then became unacceptable as well. Fascinating. So it really, so like we first get in that first level of like queer people bad, and it's like people who like queer people are also bad. And it's amazing how deep these ideologies can flow into our preferences. Ruin some basketball games for you, I guess.
I have to agree with Kayla on this. So I grew up, my father was a minister. I grew up with the, homosexuality, anything that's different is a sin for the most part. And my son is 6 and he likes to wear my nail polish. And he likes to wear my makeup every now and then. He's like, Mommy, can I try on your powder? I mean, he's 6, but my dad's side of the family is like, well, he's going to be gay. And if he is, what's the problem with that? I don't see the problem with that. He can be whatever he wants to be, but he's 6. If he wants to wear clear nail polish, he can wear clear nail polish.
Absolutely. Amy, thank you so much for that. My nephew is obsessed. He has an older sister. My nephew is obsessed with pretty toes. So he gets his toenails painted and he calls them his pretty toes. So I think it's phenomenal. And I think that if you want to put a splash of color on your extremities, go for it.
I mean, I have a friend who does drag. He actually did my makeup for my wedding. So I don't see why it was an issue.
Mm-hmm. And a common misconception is that everyone who does drag is gay. There's a lot of straight people who do drag.
Right, because it's good money.
Yeah.
I also, regarding the nail painting, my partner, a 30-year-old man in the military, went to get his toenails painted with his best friend, a female in the military, and he got his toenails painted like bright orange. And the next weekend we went to visit his family, and his dad saw his toenails and was livid, and it created conflict for the rest of the weekend. I think coming from a line of military folks within his family, it's the idea is that you have to be this like deeply masculine man, and that if you do anything that a woman does, it's not masculine. When my perception is masculinity isn't about the color that you paint your nails whatsoever. And I think that he is representing a good friend, a solid friend who just enjoys having fun and like you said, a splash of color here and there. And Brooke said in the comments, my nephews love when I do their eyebrows.
I love that. That's amazing. And I think that's amazing. And this kind of goes with the theme of like things that have kind of taken shape out of queerness, or things that have changed differently. But what's so fascinating is that their colors, the gender of colors have changed over centuries. So pink used to be an incredibly masculine color, and stiletto shoes were worn by men riding horses. I was riding cowboys. Wrong song, wrong situation. But it's amazing. So just even like we see like social contexts of these things drastically change. And I think it's amazing that this person was like, I'm gonna wear toenail polish to this family event, and it's going to ruin the weekend, because in that moment he's acting queerness because he's not fitting the most masculine idea. So queerness in the broad sense of that which does not fit our expectations of a straight cis person. In that moment he was enacting queerness and was just completely ruining some people's day. And it's that kind of influence, and we see it's just our interpretations of what that means and what has to be done with that at that moment. And so that family member seemed to rather ruin a weekend over somebody's toes than enjoy their presence, and that's a sad choice.
Agreed. He hasn't painted his toenails since.
I'll send him a bottle of paint. How are we doing in the chat?
That is it. We're all caught up.
That was amazing. Thank you all so very much for that. Keep it up. Love it. Adore it. We're going to move on just a little bit. So we've actually got an activity for you all to kind of look at this. So it's a privilege for sale. If you've ever done some of the older iterations of our Safe Zone trainings, this tends to be something that's built into it. What you're going to be, Maya's actually going to send you all a list of privileges. It's a pretty good list. I think there's about 30 options there. Each privilege we're going to say costs about $100. And we're going to give you $300. So it's Friday, it's payday. We're going to say we're going to give you $300 pretend dollars. Keyword pretend there. And we're going to have you decide what you're going to buy off of our privilege list. Maya's going to send you into breakout rooms, but in that room, I want you to talk about what privileges you're thinking about, what ones you think are some really important ones, and how you're going to spend that money, and then why those specific things. And when we come back from that breakout room, we'll have a little bit of a conversation about why specifically those things and how they've risen to the top.
Oh.
Yeah, of course. All right. How did the discussions go? A lot of fun. Was it easy to choose? Was it difficult to choose? What things did you choose and why?
It's extremely difficult to choose.
Tell me more.
I don't think that you should have to choose for a privilege.
Yeah.
But I get when you read the list that it is the way it is, and being LGBTQ plus, that you have to choose.
Yeah, absolutely. There are definitely certain ways in which we get to choose, and certainly other ones that we don't. Yeah.
And it's not right. I'm gonna put it out there. It's not right, and I don't support that.
Thanks, Amy. What about everybody else? What did you choose? What were things that rose to the top? What were things you're like, I gotta have that, no doubt about it, because blank?
Well, my colleague Alexis thought of using Maslow's hierarchy of needs to try to figure out what would be the top priorities. I think we all settled on being able to use public restrooms pretty quickly. And then there was some discussion about safety, but there were quite a few different things that would address safety issues, like being able to safely interact with police officers, also being able to get the kind of medical care that you need from a doctor. So it became kind of difficult to pick and choose and meet all of our needs. There was actually no way to meet all of our needs, but even the most baseline needs were difficult to meet.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell me about your choice for public restrooms. I'm interested in this.
Well, if you look at it through Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's a basic biological function. So you need to be able to do that. So just as a baseline function as a human being, it's nice to be able to use a restroom.
Yeah, there's like a real sense of vulnerability in public when you're like, oh, this is gonna go down. We gotta go to this. Whether you're in a Target or a Walmart, or you're at a gas station, you're like, it's going down. And no one's really thrilled about that, right? No one's ever like, oh, I get to use a public restroom. This is going to be a great time. But even then, you're like, I still gotta have that. That's still important, even though no one wants to use that. So that's really interesting. Thank you very much, James. I appreciate that.
Some from the chat are, Alicia Cohen said, being able to see partner after emergency or accident, safety issues. Annie said 27, which is living openly with your partner. Brian said raising children without worrying about state intervention and using public restrooms without fear of threat or punishment. Brian also said living openly with your partners. And then Caitlin shared living openly was important in our group. It seemed broad and important so that you don't have to live a lie or suppress who you are. And Kayla Branson shared it was incredibly difficult. I don't think I ever got to my top 3, but 2 that stuck out to me were number 12 and 30. Number 12 is being able to complete forms. Whoops, it just exited out.
Paperwork with the information you feel most accurately communicates who you are, and being able to feel safe in your interactions with police officers. Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And so what's really interesting is some of the ones that we're picking are things that truly are, for a lot of queer folk, and for not a lot of queer folk, but for a number of queer folk, can be choices of disclosure or passing. So in passing itself, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we get into other areas of this, but being able to pass yourself off as a part of the majority. So that might be a cisgender person, or that might be a straight person. It can be a choice for a number of folks, specifically trying to butch up, or in certain situations, or trying to make yourself as feminine as possible, and trying to be like, well, no one's going to help me if they think I'm blank, so I've got to pretend to be someone else. Can absolutely be a choice, and that's really interesting. Some of those are having to do with disclosure. So seeing a partner after an operation or something like that, it's the difference between saying I'm that person's loving partner of 12 years versus we're sisters. And that's not going to be weird or anything. So that's some really interesting things. What are some other thoughts? What were some other pieces? And I do just want to point out that the interactions with police officers for a number of folk, regardless of whether it's passing as a part of the majority, whether that be straight or cis, we also have to take into consideration the racial diversity of the queer community, which adds another layer of fear and uncertainty, specifically when working with some of these institutions that are not only not necessarily affirming of queer identities, but also have a histories of being incredibly racist and dangerous to a number of folks within that. So I don't want to paint queerness as being whiteness in these situations. But what were some other things? What were some of the difficulties? Were there 2 that you were going between?
So, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was going to say, I think that something that stood out to me is that it seems that depending on the other identities that we hold, it could really impact the way in which we kind of rank these privileges. For example, sponsoring your partner for citizenship, having a father who's an immigrant. Like, I know that is something that he and my mom would have prioritized if he wasn't yet a citizen. I think they met like 1 year post him becoming a U.S. citizen. But I think that's something that would be important for for example, for our international students and folks who have partners who are international. And then same with being able to access social services without fear, discrimination, or being turned away. I mean, this is an assumption, but we all work at this university. We have some sort of flow of money to help maintain our lives. But if I didn't, I think that would be something that would be at the top of my list.
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate you bringing that up, because that's something that we don't often talk about a lot, but how these other identities and their own experiences with institutions of oppression really do elevate some of these much higher than others. And while you were talking, I was also thinking about those who are chair users in the ADA community, in the disability community. We're talking about being able to use certain facilities or being able to navigate certain spaces. That's definitely one of those things where we can understand that being a higher need in certain situations where someone might be like, well, I've got to have this. Having these kind of complex, more layered and intersecting identities does absolutely raise some of these to the top. I think one of the things, and for some people, they've done this activity before, so it's a little bit easier. But then it's also sometimes easier because you're like, I know what I absolutely have to have, and a lot of times that comes out of people who have had to fight for those things, who have had to navigate certain ways of finding those. Community support, being able to express yourself. These are things that people have really said, these are meaningful to me, and so I'm going to carve out spaces for me. And so a lot of times some of these things are a lot easier. We're like, well, I've got to have that, and I know that I can do this. And I kind of want to go back to why this is called a privilege for sale, is that we too often, and I will say this, is that majority identities, those who have overlapping majority identities, so able-bodied, white, cis, straight, folks have so many of these privileges that to choose is almost like choosing your oppression. And so it's in many ways for them going like, oh, like, what can I give up? And it's interesting because when we think about, like, if you were to be given a larger money amount and you were doing this to specifically for a queer community, they'd be like, oh my gosh, I get to do all these things. This is exciting. And how that kind of plays differently. And I do just want to stress that the privileges that we experience are not because of things that we've earned. It's not a measure of the work that we've put into this. It's not a measure of your value. It is a result of oppressions, of social interactions, of ways that we have decided on certain ideologies and reinforce these through these oppressions and through these institutions. So through urban design of how we do things, through our medical system, through our law system, through education. It's not a reflection of these people and the validity of their identities, of how much privilege they have. It's a world that's crafted to disadvantage them. And so thank you very much. And I know that can be a very difficult activity to do, because there are numbers of these that we don't have access to still today. So I appreciate that. I do want to give folks a little bit of time for a bio break. So if you need to stretch your legs, if you need to use the facilities, if you need a glass of water, if you need a snack, please do so. We're going to take about 7 minutes. So we'll be back at 3:10. If you want to take a little bit of a bio break, and I'll see you soon.
Thanks, Dr. Bing.
Thank you. All right, it's 3:10 on mine. How about you, Maya?
Yep, I think we're good to go.
Beautiful. Well, as everybody kind of finds their way back, I want to just take a moment to go over what we've been talking about and kind of take stock of what I'm attempting to establish and what you all have also witnessed in your own lives. And I want to talk a little bit about what queerness is and what we've talked about it being. And when we think back to that genderbread person, we can understand and how each kind of dot of pain and each little dot of color transforms that person's identity and molds them into something unique and interesting and different. So we can say queerness is vast and queerness is endless. And as we were talking about the earrings or purple or flagging or nails, we can talk about the resilience. We can talk about how queerness has been around forever, truly since the beginning of time, and we're still here, we're still present, there's still fights, we're still working towards equity, but we also can talk about the treatment when we get under that umbrella term of what queerness is. Queerness is feared, queerness is hated, queerness is forbidden, in some situations it's seen as repulsive. And when we look at that, and we look at how queerness interacts with these institutions, such as education, such as medicine, such as law, such as religion, we can say pretty certainly that queerness is oppressed. And that is both by that which is the majority, and occasionally it seeps into that which is in the minority, in regards to gender, sexual, and romantic minorities. So even an inner oppression of those feelings and thoughts and identities. So that's kind of the place where we're coming from for this. Now, this is not just a general great talk about the wonderfulness of queerness. We're talking about this in a higher education context. And when we look at the Virginia Tech mission statement, it reads, Virginia Tech is an inclusive community of knowledge, discovery, and creativity dedicated to improving the quality of life and the human condition within the Commonwealth of Virginia and throughout the world. Pretty dang lofty. I like it. I think that the further we reach, the better. And the key words for me, and specifically in where we're kind of grounding this kind of conversation and where it sits and kind of why are we having this at Virginia Tech and why are these conversations important and why is this knowledge useful, really sits in that improving the quality of life and the human condition. And so I want you all to kind of think throughout this presentation, throughout some of the further slides that we get into, is where are we reinforcing harmful ideologies in our work? And this can be, maybe that's an ideology that we've held because it was something that was reinforced in our lived experiences, in our schools, and our churches, that we're realizing maybe isn't serving anybody, but hurting a lot. So maybe that's something that's a conscious ideology, maybe it's a subconscious ideology, and those are probably going to come along as we explore into this. But that's the question I want you to think about, is where are we enforcing harmful ideologies in our work here at Virginia Tech? All right, so let's go to college. Let's get a degree. Let's do it. Let's consider we are somebody who is a gender, sexual, or romantic minority. That is another word that we can use for queer community. That's another word that we can use for LGBTQ. There are different arguments for each of those about why we should use one over the other. Use whichever one you prefer. But let's choose a school, and here's some things that we might need to consider. Obviously, the first question of choosing a school is, can I study what I want to? Makes sense, right? And maybe that is, will my parents allow me to study what I want to? But even when we get past that, let's say this person has agency. Is my major or area of study at that university? And we're like, yeah, we can study there. So maybe like we're choosing based on location, but we've also got to study while we're at that location. So that's one of those early questions. And that's shared by a lot of folks who are trying to go to school. Sometimes they're like, what are my parents want me to study? And that's a little bit of a different conversation, but we've got to find a school that fits our interest or our parents' interest or the paying person's interest, whatever that looks like for a specific individual. And then we start to think, will I be happy there? And when we think about happiness, and this is kind of a broad use of the word happiness. When we think about happiness and we think about it in a queer context, here's some of the questions that come up when I was thinking about what are students looking for, and especially in the conversations that I've had with students who are looking at universities is, do I see pictures of myself in their advertising? So can I see myself being successful at this university? Do I know that people like me exist there and are being resilient, and are they matriculating? Do I see queer professors? Do I see trans professors? Do I see queer people of color in the advertising? Can I physically see myself there? Does it mean that there is a space for me there? Is there a student group I can join? So in the same way that we were talking a little bit about flagging, in the ways that we talk about wearing purple or nail polish or an earring or a handkerchief in some situations, there are some ways that universities can really flag that they're going to be accepting spaces for queer students. And part of that can be being able to carve out space in which students can congregate. So student organizations can be a big part of that. Is there a community that I can become part of? Or am I going to be one person in a mass? And am I going to be alone there? Is there a physical space dedicated to my identity? Here at Virginia Tech, we have the LGBTQ+ Resource Center, of which I'm immensely thankful that we do have. But our students have a physical space that they can go to. And they know that within that space, it is an affirming space. And that people, more likely than not, they will not be challenged, their identities will not be invalidated, and they can find community. Are there queer events I can go to? Now, this is a funny one, because I think there's sometimes this misunderstanding that a person who is queer knows queerness and knows queer history, knows queer people, knows queer locations, that there's kind of like they're born and they're like, I know who Elton John is and Billie Jean King. They're born with this intrinsic knowledge of queerness. And in fact, we don't. We absolutely don't. It's something you have to go out and learn. And a lot of queer folks maybe don't feel like they need to become a part and learn about the history of queerness, and that's okay. They choose not to. But it's something that they want to maybe go out and see and find. And so are there going to be spaces? Are there going to be social groups and gatherings where I can celebrate my identity, where I can learn about my community, where I can see other people gathering? You don't necessarily have to go with a group of friends, but you can go and see, and that there's a gathering, and that there's a community that thinks that this topic is important enough to gather around, to come together with. Are there classes where I can learn about myself? Again, this is another great way that universities can kind of flag of an acceptance towards the queer community. Is there a women and gender studies program, or is there a queer studies program where these students can go and actually engage academically with queerness? Is there a class that does queer literature? Is there queer film? Is there queer theory? All these various elements that have been academically ingrained into the universities. Are there spaces for that? Are there completion statistics that include my community? So this is something that is very, it's a nuanced, difficult thing for universities to conceptualize how to do this, but you may think, okay, I'm a part of a marginalized community. How many Black students have graduated from this university? That can give you an idea. How many do they admit? How many graduate? And then I can kind of understand, is the racism or is the institutional oppression or the roadblocks so horrible that these students are getting admitted but they're not going anywhere? And will I be one of those? Will I be stuck in this trap of becoming in debt for loans and really getting nothing out of this? Are there statistics that we can see that not only are queer students being admitted, but are they matriculating to degree completion? Important things to have, and very few universities actually have these statistics available because it requires an element of vulnerability, and it takes very thoughtful surveying. And it can be done. It absolutely can be done. But it means knowing at which point in a student's experience they feel comfortable disclosing a queer identity or their queerness to an institution that has a history of being oppressive. But it absolutely can be done. But are there completion statistics that include my community is an important one? And is there a living learning community that I can be a part of? So we have living learning communities like UGMA for our students of color, who they're able to live in community. They're able to be amongst each other and support each other and create these very meaningful bonds that are most likely going to help them through to degree completion. And that's another part of this flagging that we can talk about, is things that universities can do to seem like you will be happy here, because we have thought about you and we have prepared a space for you. And you're not going to have to struggle to find that, because here it is. So those are some things that universities can do, and things that students are probably looking at, and needs that students are looking at, and a little idea of that mindset. The second one, and this is a big one, is will I be safe there? So not just will I be happy there, but will my emotional, mental, and physical safety, will I be okay? So sometimes, and this takes a certain kind of student. This takes a student who understands how a marginalized identity works within a system of oppression. So a lot of times, a lot of our undergraduate students stop probably about, will I be happy here? And their parents may be thinking, will they be safe there? But these are things that we have to think about, is, are there anti-discrimination policies in place? And do they include gender identity and sexuality? Are those specific words in there? So when something comes up, I can point to that and go, this is against school policy, and this is what has to be followed. There's some kind of structural piece in writing that is very, very important. Does the university have a history of homophobia or transphobia? Now, this is something that is less likely. Yeah, you're going to get a couple of universities who have gotten in some really big trouble and are going to be in the news. But a lot of this information about, like, oh, well, don't go there, is going to be word of mouth, and it's going to be in community. And so finding that means not just going to CNN or CBS or whatever your NBC, whatever your news station is. It's going to CBS. It's going to be figuring out who's gone to certain universities and who they've had success with, and where they've had horrible administrators who've just made those spaces so incredibly hostile for these communities. Is the school located in a place that I can safely explore? Is one that is so deeply important, because we want students to come, we want them to engage, but we also want them to engage in the community, we want them to be able to give back. And that has to do with the relationship between our universities and their surrounding spaces. Here in Blacksburg, it's very integrated, in my opinion, coming from a university where there was very much a bubble of, here's the liberal college, and then here's town. And town is abandoned factories and the people who used to work in them, and a definite class difference between those who work at the university and those who live in the towns around. And so the question is, will I be safe going there? Can I go downtown? Can I go shopping? Will I be respected? Will my identity be questioned? Will I be invalidated? Will I be physically harmed? Are things to consider. And so not only, you don't just get to pick your dream school, you got to pick your town that you think that you're going to be able to navigate properly. Are there doctors in the area that will treat me? Depending on a student's need, and that can go even to just basic physical exams. Am I going to be able to see a doctor who understands and validates my identity, respects me as the human being that I am, and the respect that I deserve? Are there doctors there who are not going to harm me emotionally, mentally, physically, because of some kind of biases that they hold? Are there counselors that I can see? Especially when we're talking about students who may see the university as a time in which they can explore that, because they're no longer under the roof of a guardian who may be an oppressive source in their life. If they're seeing university as a way of freedom, are there counselors that they can talk to that are going to affirm identities, or is that going to be a very mentally and emotionally harmful environment for them? And then are there non-gendered or on-campus housing options? So let's say a person does not feel comfortable living in an all-boys dorm or all-women's dorm. Are there these options to live within community? Are very, very important things to consider. We want to make sure that these things are in place for students before they get here. We want to make sure that it's showing people, we've thought about you, we've given thought to this. It's incredibly important. So those are some things, and even just choosing a school. So let's say we found a school, they seem very, very LGBTQ plus friendly. They seem great. They've got queer people on the pamphlets. They've got queer people in classrooms. They've got living learning communities. They've got an LGBTQ plus center. They've got a student organization. Phenomenal. We're going to apply there. Let's apply. So here's a question. Can I list the name I use rather than the one that's assigned to me? And we use the words assigned to not this is my real name, this is my birth name. We're saying assigned to because at birth, and I will say this as somebody who does not use their first name, at birth, some very lovely folks who are under a great deal of stress at that moment are giving you a word that that's going to follow you everywhere you go for the rest of your life. And they're doing so based on some limited information. Sometimes it's visual cues, sometimes it's family pasts, sometimes it's just in the moment, whatever they felt like, but they give you a name. I was almost a Daphne, so I'm very thankful that some people take a breath, but then I was just a 90s Ashley, and that was awful too. But we're assigned names. And then a lot of times we're assigned a gender based on visual cues, based on ideas, but they're like, this is what you're gonna be and that's how you're gonna live in this world. So we use the word assigned very carefully here. So can I use the name that I use? A chosen name, and this can be a nickname, this can be a name that, sometimes it's a middle name, sometimes it's a name that they feel affirms their identity, so it may not be related to any other names that they've previously been assigned. I use Dr. Bing. Doctor is an accolade that I've earned, but I've always gone by Bing. And that is something that I recently found out that is a family thing that our family does. And so that's kind of a cool thing, but that is a chosen name that not only I've taken on as a queer person, but someone back in my life has also done. So on this paperwork to this place that I think is going to be the most affirming place in the world, can I even list the name I go by? Can I put a word down that I says, that's me? That's who I am. Will my legal guardians be notified if I use a name other than that legal name, that assigned name? So let's say I'm like, university is going to be my oyster. This is going to be a free place. I can be who I am. I'm out of this oppressive environment. Is there going to be mail that goes back and put me in danger? Are there policies in place? Is there information provided ahead of time that says you're going to be okay here? Whatever you put on this paper, it's between you and us, because you're an adult. I know that's a lot of times what universities are stressing. This is your first step into adulthood. Parents aren't going to hear from us, but we've got to make sure those things are in place. Is my gender identity listed, or can I write in my gender identity? So are we simply putting an M and an F and going, done for the day? Or are we thinking about queerness and its expansiveness and the ways that we can be, our identities are on very much sliding scales, and that there's a number of words for that, and there's a number of combinations of that we have. So are we providing a very expansive list that will still need a write-in option? Or are we saying male, female, non-binary, gender non-conforming, and then giving a write-in option? Are we thinking about these places? Are we making sure that even our forms, not just our websites, not just our social media, not just our plans, but our forms are communicating what we want? Can I mention that I'm queer if it's relevant in the written prompt? So am I given enough security? Am I given enough information to think this school is going to be affirming? And if it's relative, if it's related to what's being asked, if they're asking about a hard time, if they're asking about certain kind of things, if they're asking me to disclose my mind, my understanding, where I'm coming at, what I think I'm going to be able to offer this university, is my queerness going to be respected, or is it going to be something that is seen as a deterrent for them to admit me? Is there writing there that says, we embrace you, we want you here, and we want this to be an embracive and affirming environment? And then are there scholarships that I can apply to that are targeted towards my community? So has the university or has somebody in the community thought, you know what, university is incredibly expensive, degree completion is incredibly expensive, there's a lot of things that happen. I want to financially invest in the success of this community. And do I see my identity listed and see that there's value, see that someone has quite literally taken out their wallet and said, I care about you enough that I'm going to support you during this time. So things to think about, just even in the application process. We found our school. We applied. We got accepted. Congratulations, everybody. You're doing great. This is phenomenal. We got accepted. We're going to settle in. We're maybe moving out of an oppressive space. Maybe we're moving out of an affirming space. And that's pretty exciting too, because this is new places, new times. Let's just look at what we have to do to get prepared to be a college student. So can I list my chosen name and pronouns on the following documents? My intake form at the clinic. Can I present with medical needs to a place that should provide me with a medical service? Can I present authentically and genuinely? Or is there only a legal name option and I have to pretend to be somebody that I no longer identify with or have never identified with? Can I put my chosen name and pronouns in banner? Can I put it on my student card? Can I put it on my housing application? And the key point is chosen name. You're going to find a number of universities that will allow you to change your legal name and then have that legal name represented on these documents. But we don't see as many universities. There are some out there. We're absolutely looking at those and figuring out how we can make that a mainstream process. But chosen name is a very important process because the ability to change one legal name has its own barriers, because again, the legal system is an institution of oppression that has these different barriers in place. And that can be an actual financial need of how long it takes and what kind of services you need and the money that you need to be able to file that paperwork. That could be a social need of being able to have familial or a community of care and support that's saying, we affirm you doing this. There's many different ways in which just being able to change your name legally is very hard for folks. So are we buying into another system of oppression, or are we saying, yeah, we see you and we understand that. And so if you don't have your legal name changed, but you go by a different name, we're going to figure out how that works here. So can you put it on your health clinic intake form? Can you put it on banner? Can you have a student ID? Can I put it on my housing application? So that when I show up and an RA who has spent a lot of time with some glitter and some markers, who's gone through and like put on some calligraphy onto a piece of paper on their door, and I'm like, that's me, or like, oh, are these things in place? If I have a problem, is my resident advisor knowledgeable about queer issues? So if I have a question, you know, RAs are great. At the time, you're like, wow, this is an adult with so many answers. And then as you get older, you're like, wow, that was a student with not a lot of answers. But it's kind of like when you were a baby and you were being sat, like babysat, and you were like, this is a grown adult. And you realize they were like maybe 3 years older than you. And you're like, okay, this is great. John Mulaney talks about having a horse babysit a dog. And you're like, that's the kind of situation we're talking about. But are these people prepared to work with me? Can I look at you? Because you're supposed to be here for me. You're supposed to be my advisor. Can you advise me? Can you help me in the way that you're supposed to? Is there a way I can disclose my identity to my professors to avoid being misgendered and dead named? So let's say you can have a mismatch of, yes, I can have my name and pronouns here, 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 but not here, here, and here. So is there a system? And that can be as on a personal level as you as an academic who has a class full of students, but have you created a way in which a student can say, hey, you might have on a list this, but I go by this and I use these pronouns, and that's incredibly important for me that you use this. Or if you said, hey, everybody, just let me know what your pronouns are before the class starts, so that you have that and you're prepared. But is there a system of way that students can disclose to you to avoid misgendering? So misgendering, using the wrong pronouns for an individual, assuming someone's identity based on visual cues, based on some of these ideas and these ideologies of like what people look like and what certain identities must look like. Dead naming, using a name that a person does not use. That could be a legal change, that could be a social change. But if I show up and I'm like, hey, everybody, I'm Bing, and you're like, what's up, Ashley? I'm going to be like, what is going on with you? That's not my dead name, because I haven't legally changed my name, and there's not this deep connection of like, that's not me. I'm probably just going to look at you like, that's weird. You do that to somebody who has gone through a deep lifetime complication where they've had to maneuver through so many institutions of oppression. And then when they show up to you and you call them something that is not a part of who they are, that's disrespect. That's dead naming. We want to avoid that at all possible. So is there a way that we're making sure that students can disclose without deeply harming them? And are there all gender restrooms on campus that I can use? So you may do that like really cool walk where you're like, I'm a college student, I'm gonna go to all my classes, this is gonna be cool and fun, and I'm gonna walk around and see where all the buildings are. Maybe you go with like a gaggle of friends. But imagine having then go, okay, well, do I know where I can use the restroom where I'm not gonna get weird looks, where I'm not gonna get reported, where I'm not gonna be harassed? Do I know where those are? Is that information available? Do they exist? Because these aren't always things that we think of at the very beginning. And some of these could be moved to, am I going to be happy and am I going to be safe? But these are things that we constantly have to consider. So we are college students now. We have settled in. We're going to do all the things. Now we've got to engage with people. And now I want you to step back from being a college student. I know it's a lot of work. Whew, tired. We're going to step back into our positions. We're going to step back into our chinos and professional shoes and our polos, our nice monogram polos, or our monogram. We're going to be we're going to engage with these students. So they've gone through a world. They've gone through a world that has not been designed for them. They have experienced oppression and discrimination in so many ways, in so many places that we deem are moral and ethical. Now we're going to engage with these students. We're going to do this. And I've actually moved forward too many times. So we're going to engage with our students. And there are a number of times when we engage with queer folk that there are vulnerable moments for them in these interactions. And the key goal in all of these interactions is to reduce harm, because these are people who live in a world that was not designed for their success, was not designed for their well-being, and continues to put more burdens in places constantly. So our goal is going to be to reduce harm, and we can do this in a number of areas, and I've kind of picked out a couple of places and where we can very noticeably reduce harm. And that can be choosing educational materials, when we're making introductions, when we're setting ground rules for environments in which we are sharing, when we're hosting discussions, when we're sharing thoughts and ideas, and when we're accommodating student needs, and when we're providing resources. So we're going to dig into this a little bit more. So when we are choosing educational materials, keyword is educational because we're like, we want them to get something out of this. We're going to pick some really great sources. It's important to know that a number of very credible sources have added to the discrimination of queer people, to the oppression of queer people. The DSRM is included in this, something that we've considered to be kind of the Bible of like what's going on with queer people, has been an oppressive source to them, has written it off as a mental illness, has done these things. So we need to consider, yeah, this may be a credible source, but is it a positive source? Is this something that's going to be beneficial to the learning of my students? So when we're picking out materials that touch on LGBTQ plus topics, issues, or lived experiences, there's a couple of questions you can ask yourself. Could this unfairly vilify the queer community? So let's say we're in an abnormal psychology class. We want to talk about like the real like freaky deaky moments of like, wow, people have snapped, and we want to do this. Are we picking out queer case studies and being like, look at this, look at how messed up this is? And is it being misunderstood as look at how vilifying queerness is versus look at mental illness? And look at how interesting this is. Want to make sure that we're not drawing connections unfairly to populations. Does this source include language that stigmatizes gender, sexual, and romantic minorities? Again, our language is changing. Like I said, we might have a new version of the genderbread person by the time we get out of this meeting. Our understanding of language is constantly changing. Queer is now something that we see as affirming. There are other words that are not. There are ways that we haven't had words that we now have new words, and that's exciting and new. But am I using a source that is using affirming language? And if I'm not, am I making sure that there's some kind of notice that says, hey, the language in this, not good. Some of this information, good. We're going to use that part. I want you to know that this does not have my approval. Does the author draw connections between the queer community and illnesses that may be misunderstood as causational? Again, we've got to look at this. These are young, beautiful, brilliant minds, but their minds are trying to make connections as easily as possible. So we've got to think about when are we presenting queerness and in what context are we presenting queerness in? Who benefits from the work that's being published? An amazing question to think about is who's publishing this, what identities do they hold, and who has benefited from this research being put out there. And this kind of goes to that dark side of all academic research of this. Are we doing harm in publishing these things? And am I profiting off of someone else's lived experiences, and who's experiencing this? So is it a good work? And I'm thinking, Paris is Burning, and what has been hailed as this amazing documentary into the ball culture that has existed in history and in the world. The people who participated, and this is a very anthropology kind of way to look at this, but the people who were interviewed, the people who had their lives examined, received very little compensation, and yet it used their likeness, it used their faces to open this queerness open to the world. And you have to ask yourself, am I presenting this stuff critically if it's not being produced to the benefit or beneficence of the queer community? So we've got to look at why it's being published and who benefits from it being published. Is this adding to someone's ideas of what queerness is, or is it opening doors? What has been the response from the queer community regarding this artifact? So there's going to be some layers here, right? Because we've got academic queers who honestly sometimes have a vocabulary that is so drastically different than somebody who's just hanging around, having a great life, that you've got to make sure that we're looking at the various levels. So you might just be able to like, hey, Bob, I know you're gay. Like, what did you think about this thing? Like, that's great for Bob, but I need you to look at the queer community. How is this community understanding this? So make sure that you're looking up responses when you're saying maybe this isn't made by a queer person about queer people. But let's see what they thought about this. And if there's evidence that this is harmful, if there's evidence that's misleading, that it is not good research, we've got to do our due diligence to make sure that we're vetting this material properly. And is one identity presented as representative of the entire LGBTQ community? And this is a huge problem, and the queer community itself is very, very much guilty of this, of presenting whiteness and queerness and gay male queerness as being the face of queerness. So we want to make sure that we're showing the racial diversity, the body diversity that exists within the queer community, and that we're being fair to this, that we're showing that, because when we talk about how gay men, white men have been the face of queerness, it's hysterical in a way, because white men, being some of the most privileged identities, are the ones who are being pushed forth going, no, 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 this is what the LGBTQ community looks like. Let's not do that. Let's not continue sharing this myth about what queerness is and trying to make it okay because there are white men in it. Let's make sure that we are drawing from materials that are talking about the experiences of trans women of color. Let's talk about non-binary. Let's talk about asexual. Let's talk about the identities that don't get as much highlight because they don't have as many privileged identities. So we want to make sure that we're doing that as well. Making introductions, the formatting of this is great. Let me be very, very, very clear, is that in every single situation, professionals set the standard. You will set the standard in whatever room you gather people in. If that's a Zoom room, if that's a physical room, you are setting the standard. So if you include your pronouns in your introduction, so if I were to say, hey, I'm Dr. Bing, you share her pronouns, blah, 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 here's what we're gonna do today, that's the expectation. And other people have been given the opportunity to opt in. If they want to share their pronouns, now it's normal. They can do so without pressure of feeling like I have to do this, and they can feel like, oh, if I want to, I can share. This is a space that's going to be accepting of that. It should never be mandatory. And this has been an issue. I know we've seen it in various situations in which we felt like we're being super inclusive by making everyone put down pronouns, but that does put unnecessary pressure on folks who may be trying to figure out what pronouns best fit them, or folks who are using pronouns that would not visual cues fit what you expect of them, therefore outing them to a community. So disclosing on their behalf at a time that they have not chosen to people that they have not chosen to disclose to. So we want to avoid that at all possible. Allow students to introduce themselves rather than calling out names from a list. This is a great way to avoid misgendering and dead naming folks. So if you let somebody take agency in their life and say, hey, I'm Bing, I use she, her pronouns, what's up, how's it going? Instead of being like, what name do I have on this list? And can I kind of figure out where you are and assume who I can find? Let's avoid that. Besides, you're going to say someone's name wrong. It's going to be a bad time. Just don't. Just let them speak for themselves and let them present as authentically as humanly possible. Let it be known that a change in pronouns and name over time will be respected. So we may have a student who comes in with a certain name and set of pronouns at the very beginning, and about halfway through their semester, they're having some time, they're having some experiences, they're doing some soul searching, and they have a change. You need to make sure that that space is being affirming, that there are things in place and ways of communicating with you where that's going to be affirmed. And it's okay if they want to try some things out, because this is supposed to be a space where students can show up very authentically. This is work. This is work as a professional. You got to think about these things, but it's work that Virginia Tech has tasked you to do when we're talking about the betterment of human life and the human condition. And make sure that process is in place. So there's going to be folks that you're working with, maybe a graduate student, maybe a student that you're having in multiple classes. Just make sure that there's a way that someone can update you. Maybe that's just physically saying, hey, it's cool if you ever just want to tell me. And if you prefer that I just check in with you every so often, that's cool too. But make sure that you're having conversations with people so that they know that there's an open door and that they don't feel like they have to stay in an identity or be referred to in an identity that does not fit with who they are. We want these students to be as affirmed and set up for success as any other student in that room. So setting ground rules and / creating affirming spaces is how we're going to guarantee that our classrooms are assisting students in the best way possible. And we want to make sure that respect and dignity is at the core of all of our interactions. And you can word that however you would like to, but I think that's a very important place, because when we get into transphobia, when we get into homophobia, we're not asking people to toss aside whatever beliefs they have created. We're asking you to, in this space, in this classroom, respect me. I need your respect because I'm a human being who deserves it. It's important that clear statements about how acts of discrimination will be handled. So if I'm walking into a classroom and they're like, well, we'll figure it out. I'm like, well, I don't want to be here. I don't want to be here if my well-being is in danger. So you need to make sure that we provide statements, and that can be as a department, that can be as a classroom, that can be as a project, that can be whatever that looks like for you, that include but not limited to how you're going to handle homophobia, transphobia, slurs, hate speech, bullying. Because as much as we want to believe that our precious little angels are all going to be very kind to each other, we need to make sure that there's some kind of statement that's presented that's how this is going to be worked out. Make it clear that questions do not necessarily signify beliefs. So it's very important, and this is kind of a setup for how this session is being working, is it's important that we're taking a pause and saying, if you have a question, it's important for you to learn it here in this educational space, in this space in higher ed that's carved out to promote education and learning, that we take a moment and say, ask a question, because opinions hurt people. Questions inform people. So as long as a very genuine and authentic question is being asked, let's first try and figure out where that's coming from, if it is offensive, but let's make sure that we're not just making assumptions about someone's belief. Establish the validity of an identity is not up for discussion or debate. This can happen a lot of times in classroom discussions. It's important to have this as a part of of an assignment. So let's say you're in a speech class and you're like, we're gonna have a debate, here's the topics. But here's how this is going to go. And if the validity of someone's identity comes up, it's a null point. We're not going to have that. We're not going to have this be a harmful situation in which we are endangering the mental, emotional, and social well-being of these human beings. And we want to make sure that we're setting a stage for understanding to come first and then challenging. So it's really important that we know if a student's just trying to figure out what queerness looks like and how their own understanding, because they've experienced it in a world of oppression and institutions that have reinforced ideologies that now they're starting to see maybe don't necessarily fit. We want to make sure that we first seek to understand. So, as I said, professionals set the standard. So we'll do this rapid style. If someone says that's so gay, what's a way that we can take that and turn it into something?
I might say, like, what do you think that gay means? To get a better understanding of, like, what are they trying to say about what was just said or happened, so that it's a moment of education.
Okay, yeah. Just figure out what they're drawing connections between. Stephanie, I saw you on mute.
I was just going to say, what do you mean by that? Like, tell me what you mean by that.
Yeah, ask clarifying questions, because if it's, oh, that was a off the cusp kind of like retort that I have been grown up in an oppressive society that has told me that queerness is bad, give them that moment to go, oh, I drew connections improperly. But if they go, it's homosexual and that's bad, then you go, okay, so now we're being explicit about it and we can have a conversation about that. If someone says they just haven't met the right woman or man yet, what do we say? How do we make that work? And please feel free to use the chat if you're figuring this out yourself. There are no wrong answers. There's no one right answer, to be honest. As long as you can make it work in the context and the relationship that you have with students, you can make these things work. So if they go like, oh, they're gay, but they just haven't met the right man yet, or they just haven't met the right woman yet. And this can be true of bisexual. This happens a lot of times, in fact, with a lot of the bisexual communities, that they're stigmatized into being like, well, they just haven't met the right person of the opposite sex yet. How do we challenge that or seek to understand?
Someone in the chat, Brian, said that's an assumption that they are attracted to the opposite, sex.
Mm-hmm.
And then Alicia said, I think she would say, not everyone wants to be in a relationship. And then Andrew said, how do we know who a person is attracted to?
Yeah.
Alexis said, you're assuming that they need a relationship for fulfillment.
Look at that. These are really great things. Question, seek to understand. When is explicit, we challenge. The same can be said if I could never be with a man. When we're referencing to trans women, we say, tell me about what you think about that. Tell me about where that comes from. Let's talk about that a little bit, and let's talk about the danger of that. There's different ways to work at this, and I'm trying to keep an eye on time because I do see it's like 3:50. But there are ways in which we can take these things and work with them. Diane Goodman has a really great worksheet, and I'll make sure that Maya sends it to folks, about how to work with microaggressions and how we can turn things. So when you said blank, I felt blank, and I would like you to blank. I'm noticing here, and I'm wondering if others are feeling and noticing the same. So ways that we can redirect kind of ideas and these things that can be said during shared discussions, during shared space, that we can kind of look to first understand and then challenge. I noticed that you were blank. I used to do that too, but then I learned here. So being able to use your human messiness to make changes in a really great way to do this. So Diane Goodman, DaneGoodman.com, great human being who has this nice little worksheet, and I'll make sure that Maya shares that as well. There's times when we offend. We're not human. We're not perfect humans. We are humans for the most part. But we're going to make mistakes. And it's okay that if you have rapport with a student, to be able to say, hey, you know, I noticed that when I said this, you kind of made a reaction. I think I messed up. And if you'd be willing to help me, that's like great. But it's also really important that you understand there's a power difference, especially if you're a professor, if you're an administrator, that you've got this power over a student, and they may not necessarily feel comfortable being the educator in that moment. This particularly can come up when you misgender someone. It could be that you have misgendered the person in front of you, or you've misgendered somebody and they're correcting you. There's a lot of a tendency to say, oh, I'm so sorry, and to feel bad for the harm that we've done or that act of violence that we've enacted in that space. It's better to say thank you. I was wrong, thank you, than to then put them in a place where now they have to go, no, it's okay. When I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry, because that's what we want to soothe someone else's discomfort. So we want to make sure that we're being clear about this. We want to make sure that we're considering the various power levels that exist in a room, because we're going to make mistakes. And we want to make sure that we're being gracious when we make mistakes and we're being called out on those things. Thank you for correcting me. Thank you for letting me know. I appreciate your willingness to talk about this. I really appreciate it. I'm going to integrate it into what I'm doing next. And these are ways that we ourselves can set the standard as professionals. And there's a way to accommodate student needs. So basically, through the last nearly 2 hours, we talk about the various experiences. That's exhaustive and exhausting to go through this, to pick a school, to apply, to try and figure out if this is going to be a space that you're going to be set up for success, or if you're going to go home and cry every single day. It's an exhausting process. And queer students who are maneuvering higher education may be exploring their gender and sexual identity, financially supporting themselves in their education because of a lack of a support system. They may be mourning that support system. So maybe they had a very supportive and loving family until they disclosed, and now they're by themselves. And they've got to deal with that. They've got to take care of themselves. They be trying to figure out how to disclose to a family and possibly put themselves in a vulnerable position where they may be on their own financially and socially. They may be trying to find a community of care. They may be dealing with deep, deep loneliness and feeling like they can't succeed because there's no one around them that they can see succeeding. They may be beginning and going through a journey of gender affirming procedures. In that itself, in the same way that we'd be like, oh, you have a doctor's appointment? That's great. Get yourself taken care of. We've got to make sure that we're understanding that it's just a general form of self-care. And where they may be dealing with these other structures of oppression, like the legal system, trying to get things changed. And that, again, can be very exhaustive and exhausting. And so students are constantly dealing with this. And we want you to understand that students may come to you and be like, I am truly doing the best I can, but here's the amount of crap that I have to deal with right now on top of what I'm doing for you in this class. And I'm really trying, but I'm living in a world that's not set up for my success. And we ask in a very ethical and moral way to be an understanding human being in those moments. To consider what it looks like when we try and make a space affirming. And in classrooms and in various situations that looks differently. And I'm not going to tell you that extensions are the best way or this is what it's going to look like, but to consider the amount of baggage that students bring in that they never asked for, that they don't deserve, and that's not a signifier of their own well-being and what they deserve to live through in this world. So we ask that to be thoughtful and to understand and look for these signs that students are very much struggling with this amount of personal work that they're having to do because the world was not set up for them to live in. And then we ask you to provide resources when you can. In the university at Virginia Tech, we use Navigate. When you refer students, it's a great source, it's a wonderful source. There's a few things that I, as a queer professional, would ask that you do. One is to seek consent from the student before you share their name and contact information, even if you're referring them to me. If you're saying, oh, this person would really do well if they were connected with the resource center and if they had those resources, ask for consent, because I don't want to reach out to a student and say, hey, your professor said you wanted to talk. And they're like, what? I did what? And then now they feel, one, that they have, even if they wonder if they've been disclosed, if that privacy has been taken away from them, if it is an active betrayal, or if you've made assumptions on their behalf and they no longer feel like they can live and work in that space with you, because now they feel like they're under a microscope. So get consent. Provide as little detail in that referral as possible so that I don't receive an email that has a student's life story and I don't get to meet that student. That student doesn't get to show up and tell me what they want me to know. As little detail as humanly possible, because when a referral comes through, I will reach out to that student. I'll say, hey, do you want to meet up? I see that maybe you're interested in chatting with me because you've consented to this and you're like, I want to be connected with that person and I want to do that. Let them come in and share whatever information they want to. Let them have the agency to do that. So provide as little detail as humanly possible in that. Fill in the absolute minimum things, and we're gonna have that conversation. We're gonna have a shared experience. And it's very important to know that unless a student comes to you expressing difficulty related to their gender identity or sexual identity, don't assume that they need to be connected to the resource center. They may already know about the resource center. If you see someone in a restroom and it's making someone else uncomfortable, don't go and interrupt that student's life and be like, did you know there's a resource center that has information about other restrooms you could use? Let that person be. Don't interrupt that student's life. Don't assume that they don't know where they need to be or that they don't know what resources are available to them. So unless they come to you and say, I'm having trouble, do you know where I can go to? Let them be. We want to make sure that we are supporting them, giving them agency, giving them room to grow and breathe and do these wonderful things. So outside of directly connecting them in Navigate to me, there are a number of resources on campus, including our numbers of student organizations. So if they're just looking for community, there's Hokie Pride, which is generalized LGBTQ plus UCSO, which is University Charged Student Organization, meaning they receive a budget line from the university. There's QTPOC, which is our queer and trans people of color organizations. True Colors, which are our trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming student organization. VT Hero, which is our core of cadets, LGBTQ plus organization, and Students for Cultivating Change for those folks who really love agriculture. So we've got organizations for people and their interest in what they're looking for. Outside of student organizations, the LGBTQ plus Resource Center website is incredibly useful. It's got information about what we're doing. There's a number of things here that you can look at. If you're wanting to understand the history of the center, that's cool. My history buffs, I like you. But there's also a number of things that show what kind of events we're doing, what kind of resources we have available, what kind of programs and trainings are available. Specifically, when we look, and also we have a number of on-campus partners, off-campus partners, and online resources. So if you're just looking for somewhere to get a scholarship, hit online resources. And if students are looking for that, we have that, and we have a very long list of online resources available too, as well as my information if they ever need it. It has a link to our all gender restroom project. The green dots is a place where there is an all gender restroom in a building. This is something that we are working and using to expand the amount of all gender restrooms on campus, but there is a map available for students and it is available in downloadable PDF. So if students want to take that to class with them to figure out where they can use a restroom where they feel comfortable, they can do so. But this is a very lovely resource that a lot of people don't necessarily know about. It's something that's going to be changing and updating as we continue to work on our progress. We had 2 restrooms over the summer, greenlit and done. which is phenomenal. So there is a group of people who are working on this. And in fact, it is the LGBTQ plus working group. So not only are there projects going on, there is an actual group of people who come together and say, here are some things that our university could be doing better as a result of a Kristen Run report that was done in 2019, saying, here's where your university just isn't hitting the mark. And so there is a lovely group of professionals who get together and are working on that. And we're currently working on forming task forces about people who are specifically going to work in specific areas. So that could be mental health, that could be training, that could be working with the Corps of Cadets, that could be student professional development, these various different areas. So if you or someone else is looking to get engaged, or if they have a specific need, the LGBTQ plus working group is a great place to let that be known. So a lot of very cool things. We've also got a Safe Zone program that is back. It is revamped. It has been redesigned from a 1-day program to a 5-week commitment. That means that you really have to want it and you've really got to be committed to this, and it's designed for exactly that way. So it's 5 weeks. You receive curriculum on the Monday. You can technically access it whenever you want, but you have curriculum on Monday. You're expected to read it, write back around it, respond to some folks, and then on that following Friday or Thursday, you get on Zoom and we talk about it, because we want to make sure that you're processing and understanding the materials as proper. Today, actually, the links for the next training session are live. So if you go to Gobbler Connect and looked up Safe Zone Training, you will see it. There's also information in our listserv, which is also available on our website. And we've got a Hokie now because we're really cool. And the university believes that this is a valuable asset. Again, flagging, using things to show that we're an affirming space, always trying to do this. We've got the next dates specifically for our Safe Zone training is October 19th through the 20th. Like I said, the links are live now. If that doesn't fit your schedule, we've got tons of other, right now Virtual Safe Zone is running about 3 sessions a semester and then 2 during the summer. So a lot of opportunities, but they are smaller groups so that when you come around on Friday, we don't have like 2 people talking, we have 10 people talking at all times. So it's a really cool time. We do have the LGBTQ plus Resource Center. There's a beautiful informational video that I'll also have Maya send out the link to if you are interested in it, because I want to be mindful of your time. But there are many resources within the actual physical space that we offer as well. But we are at full time, and I want to be respectful of that. So I'm going to hand this back over to Maya. Thank you very much for your captive audience, participation and vulnerability, and your nonverbal smiles and head nods. I'm deeply, deeply honored to be here with you.